For an objective 9.4 of Chapter 9, we're going to just talk about a couple of other long-term liabilities. First, we're going to talk about a pension. A pension is a promise from a corporation, well, it could be from a government, but we're talking about corporate reporting. It's a promise to make fixed payments to employees when they retire. So these payments are based upon a formula. It's not like a 401k. A 401k is a trust for the benefit of the employee, and the employee can take the money in a trust and 401k and transfer it to whoever they want when they pass. They can they benefit when the market goes up, or they're at risk if the market goes down. In contrast, the pension fund invest their assets, and then they're required to make fixed payments to the employees. The payments are typically based off of how many years you work for the company, your average salary the last 5 years. It's a formula. All right, so that's a pension. The liability, so they project those obligations and they take a present value. A liability is the present value of the obligation to make payments to employees, less in their retirement, less the fair value of pension plan assets. So we're talking about liabilities here, and that is only true if the present value of the obligation of payments is greater than the fair value of plan assets. There is such a thing as a pension asset whenever the obligation is less than the fair value of plan assets, but in this objective we're just talking about liabilities. So we're in this case, if you've heard about the state of Illinois in the press, their problem is that the amount of plan assets is far less than the present value of the obligation. It doesn't necessarily mean they can't make payments now, but it would indicate that at some point in the future that they will not have they may not have the requisite cash flow to make payments to retirees. This is about all we're going to say with pensions. We're not going to do any of the quantitative part, but you should know that they can appear as a long-term liability, and in particular when the present value obligation is greater than the fair value of plan assets. All right, the other long-term liability, we've already looked at bonds and long-term notes, but the other one that you may see is a lease liability. It may even be called lease payable, but it'll be classified, at least the part 2 in the out years, classified as long-term liability. Now, this is a little complicated. It's not all leases, it's just some leases. We aren't going to do the classification of a lease. In other words, I'm not going to ask you to say, is this one of the leases that will record a liability or not? You're going to get a problem that's going to tell you it's a capital lease, and that's the buzzword. Capital lease is capitalized lease equipment. That means recognize a long-term asset on the balance sheet and a long-term liability. So they do have to be, if they're long-term liabilities, the leases have to be long-term. They also have to be non-cancelable. And then under GAAP, there's other criteria we're not going to talk about. But GAAP calls the leases that are recorded, they're called capital leases. And we're going to record a leased equipment asset and a lease payable or lease liability. Now, what does the lease liability equal initially and the leased equipment? They're both going to equal the present value of GAAP required payments. Okay? So in this example, Angel Incorporated is leasing a truck for 6 years. They return at the end of 6 years, and they make payments in advance, which is typical of a lease, that the payments would be in advance. If you ever rented an apartment, you don't pay at the end of the month for the current month. You pay at the beginning for the next month. The lease is non-cancelable. It uses a discount rate of 8%. If we're going to calculate a present value, you need a rate. And it qualifies as a capital lease. So there's the word you need to know. A capital lease is the one that's recorded. So let's think a second for this timeline here. 0, let's see, 3 is about there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So 3K, that's 3,000, 3,000, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are payments in advance. So you start the lease here. This is lease inception. And in year 6, return truck here. All right. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 payments. And just like with your apartment, you pay in advance, you get to use this entire year. All right. The lease capitalized, present value of $3,000, annuity due, 8%, 6 periods. It's 3,000 times, let's see, 8%, 6 periods, 4.9927. 4.9927 equals 14,978. Okay. So we capitalize leased equipment of 14,978, capitalize a long-term liability called lease liability 14,978. On day 1, they also have a payment of 3,000, which would reduce the lease liability. It's possible to have a lease where the payments are in arrears. For example, you may have seen like, I'll lease this car, and the first month's free. Then it becomes ordinary annuity. But in this case, the payments in advance, which is more usual with lease. And so the lease liability on day 1, here's the amount capitalized. And actually, we talk about the long-term asset. Here's the capitalized amount. But the balance of the lease after day 1 would be 14,978 minus the 3,000. So you have your lease liability, 14,978 minus 3,000, 11,978. All right. So that's pensions and leases. Just a couple other long-term liabilities. Know how to calculate the amount of lease capitalized due and do the initial recognition of the lease. All right, that's it for Chapter 9.